A few years ago, I was employed as an IT consultant at a biochemical research office in the middle of nowhere in East Anglia. It usually took about an hour and a half to get from where I lived out to the office, but the pay was decent, so I was quite happy with the long commute. One Sunday night in late August, I got called up at 11:45 from my supervisor telling me there had been some massive system-wide crash in the evening, and that she needed me to come in pronto to get it sorted before the morning. I knew I'd get good compensation, so I downed 2 cups of coffee, hopped in my car, and headed off for the office. The drive was mainly along a motorway, although at that hour, it was almost all populated by lorries. However, a good stretch took me through a tract of rural countryside, which was crisscrossed by narrow roads, bordered by large hedgerows and small woods. I'll admit that it was a bit creepy driving through the desolate pastures and forests at midnight on an isolated expanse of road. Thanks to the trafficless conditions, I arrived in a little under an hour, and I spent the rest of the night debugging, fueled by copious amounts of coffee and Red Bull. I was done by about 4:30, by which time I was all too happy to be heading home to get some shut-eye. I stepped into my car and waved goodbye to the security man, who, apart from my supervisor, was the only other occupant of the building at the time. I was setting off just as the sky was turning that deep, early morning blue, and the air was beginning to be filled with birdsong. I passed out on the office park, where the building was located, and I crossed over into the dense bocage of the country. I did my best trying to stay alert, and kept my eye on the winding road, which was even emptier than it had been when I drove up. But after about 20 minutes, my car sputtered to a stop. I yawned and checked the tank. It was still half full. I glanced at the clock. It read 5 minutes to 5. I quietly swore to myself. This was just about the worst place to break down, and my tech expertise doesn't really cover car engines. I switched on my old flip phone and was surprised and damn thankful that I had any service. I called AAA and gave them my location, telling the operator that I had broken down. They said someone would be out as soon as possible, probably within an hour. I was extremely tired but decided to keep myself awake by getting out into the fresh morning air. It was getting lighter, and the surrounding landscape was bathed in the morning blue, but I estimated it would still be an hour before the sun came up. I lit a cigarette and stood smoking against my car for a few minutes, surveying the topography of the land. My part of the road was sandwiched between a small copse and a field bordered by tall hedges that rose into a slight hill topped with a large tree. The road ahead was on an incline, so I couldn't see much beyond where it crested at the top. Through the trees of the copse, I could make out the shape of what appeared to be an old elm's cottage, although I think it might have been abandoned. It hadn't been more than a minute after I'd put out my cigarette when I saw a dim yellow light, which I assumed was from a low battery flashlight, approaching from the road ahead and led by 3 dark figures. I stood upright, squinted into the darkness, thinking that they were perhaps masochistic joggers or farm laborers heading off for work. However, as the silhouettes got closer and became clearer, I saw that they weren't holding flashlights at all, but rather old-fashioned lanterns, with wicks burning away in small glass boxes. As they approached, I got a look at them in the morning light, and by the way they were dressed, I thought they must be going to some kind of reenactment. One of them was a policeman, but instead of wearing a high-vis vest and a heavy belt, he was dressed as an old village constable, with a black uniform and shiny buttons, with an honest-to-God silver whistle chain dangling out of his pocket. Another was in the garb of a farmer, with a tweed suit and flat cap, and seemed to be holding something heavy. As he got closer, I realized that it was a double-barreled shotgun, which made me more than a little nervous. I couldn't get a good look at the last one until they came right up to me, as he was in all black. But as soon as I glimpsed his collar, I realized that he must have been a vicar. As they approached me, I could see by their eyes that they were all terrified. The constable spoke first. "Pardon, sir, but have you seen a lass in white come down this way?" He spoke broad Norfolk, and seemed overly formal in his address. "No, sorry. Something wrong?" At that, They turned to each other. "Reverend?" said the man in tweed. The vicar seemed deep in contemplation. "If she hasn't come along the road, then she'll be miles away by now," said the constable. "Nonsense. She couldn't possibly get out over the fence before dawn," declared the man in tweed, looking towards the vicar, although he said nothing in response. "We'd need a bloody aeroplane to catch her now, George. There's no chance she hasn't gotten away." This solemn declaration was followed by a moment of awkward silence. "Not unless she went into the wood," the Reverend said eventually. "Well, that's it then. Come on," said the farmer, motioning towards the copse. "I won't go in there, George, and that gun of yours won't do naught to save us, and I reckon you know it too, Reverend." "If she gets away, then it's on our hands," said the vicar quietly. "Let's just pray we find her before daybreak." The constable nodded gravely, and the trio turned towards the small group of trees. "Can I be of any help?" I finally asked. Although, to be honest, I was afraid of saying anything. It didn't matter, though, as the vicar slowly turned and looked towards me as if he'd heard a very soft noise. It was as if they could no longer see me at all. I was at once glad and terrified. With that, the three of them trudged off, and I watched as the ghostly procession crossed over the low dry stone wall bordering the copse, and, with the vicar leading them, they disappeared into the trees. I stood still against my car, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. But after a few minutes, I came to the conclusion that in my sleep-deprived state, I must have begun to hallucinate. Although I reasoned that nothing like that had ever happened to me before, my eyes kept drooping, so I lit another cigarette and decided to walk up the adjacent field, which was bordered by a brittleway that led up the knoll. I crossed over a narrow footbridge and followed up the side of the field until I reached the large oak tree that stood on the hilltop. I surveyed the landscape hidden by the ridge, which was all broad, fen country, crisscrossed with hedgerows, sunken streams, and canals. From my view on the slate promontory, I couldn't make out a single hamlet, farmstead, or grain silo for miles. There was a remarkable absence of any sign of human habitation, and I was suddenly struck with how bizarre it was that the three men must have been trekking for miles in the dark with only the dim light of their lanterns. By then I was sure that they must have been real, for I could very clearly picture their worried and haggard faces in my mind. Something odd I noticed was that the trees that bordered the side of the road, which I thought had made up a small copse, seemed to stretch out a good ways further, and consisted of a considerable tract of dense woodland, now lit up by the red sky of the early dawn. I couldn't quite reconcile this in my mind, as I distinctly remembered stopping on the side of the road and glancing at the old elm's cottage through the thin tree line. Now the trees enveloped the land, and the cottage was nowhere to be seen. Just then, I heard a very distinct but discernible crack, which I immediately realized must have been a gunshot. I put out the cigarette just as the tip of the sun crested the horizon, and took one last glance westward before heading down, when I spotted something coming towards me from the other side of the hill. There was a distant white figure bounding up the brittleway at quite a pace. I can't quite describe the sensation, but I suddenly felt oppressively tired, my vision blurred, and I was struck by a sharp headache, similar to that feeling you get when you stand up too quickly. This was accompanied by a feeling of unrelenting and biting dread. As my head cleared, I watched the white shape draw near. It almost appeared to be limping and running at once. I believed at the time that the strange figure was a woman. Her long black hair fluttered against the wind. I vainly shouted to see if she was all right, but I was met with no reply. The unknown woman in white only continued bounding up the bridleway, seemingly faster than before. I was now increasingly worried, and looked around for any sign of the three strangers I had met not 5 minutes ago, or, indeed, anyone in the surrounding countryside. As it was, I was alone, with this stranger charging towards me in her unsettling hobble. I decided I would feel safer in my car, and turned to walk back down the hill when what was, without a doubt, the most sickening noise I've ever heard sounded from behind me. I can't say it was a scream, for I swear it couldn't have been within the range of any human voice, and was more akin to a kettle coming to a boil, But this benign analogy was far from my mind when the wail resounded over the fields. It brimmed with an unrelenting rage and red-hot fury, although behind this, it was clear the noise was wholly rooted in an impressibly dejected and desolate suffering. Whatever had made that sound was so fierce and frenzied and alone that I had no doubt I would have met an awful end had I not taken off running down the hill. Before I fled, I hurriedly looked back in terror, and there it was, not 20 feet away. I knew then that it was an impossible distance to have closed in the 2 seconds that had elapsed since I first heard its wail. But there it was, half limping the speed of an Olympian. I ran like I've never ran before, and as I raced down the bridleway, I heard that noise a second time, and once more before I reached the hedgerow that bordered the road. By then I could hear it moving on the ground, its uneven steps heaving it forward at an unnaturally fast pace. I leapt over the footbridge and ran out into the road, nearly out of breath, and now with the awful realization that I couldn't outrun my pursuer. Just as I reached my car, I heard the hum of a distant engine, and I hurriedly looked up the road, where a dark shape was crossing the distant horizon. As I shaded my eyes from the sun, I caught a glimpse of the flashing yellow emergency lights of a AAA repair vehicle descending the road ahead. I span around, expecting to be confronted by that dreadful, limping white figure, but the road was empty. I was alone. Incredulous, I looked up at the hill, scanning the fields for any trace of the woman in white. I found none. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of the tow truck, listening to the AAA repairman going on about the advantages of an early morning shift. Somehow the banality of my situation seemed utterly ridiculous. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and needless to say, I didn't sleep until the following evening. Just as we departed that stretch of road, we both heard a barely audible gunshot. The repairman remarked that it must be rabbit hunters, but I remained silent. As the truck crested the ridgeline, I glanced back towards the hill. I caught sight of a piece of white fabric stuck in the oak tree, and watched as it wrestled itself free with the breeze and fluttered off towards the sunrise.